Hello again. My name is Charles Sabo, and I'm doing another teaching video on the book of Isaiah. I'm doing chapter 7 today. I have written a Bible commentary called Isaiah, a Bible commentary. I wrote it in most fully in 2018 and the first half of 2019. Now, the book came out published in January of this year. It's a hardback binder commentary, great for Bible studies. It's also a college textbook. Now, you can also pick it up on Google as well as Amazon. When I say Google, Google, Amazon, there's an ebook available. There's also something on eBay. Now, I'm going to go into chapter 7. Now, the first 5 chapters were the awes and woes towards Israel. This chapter 6 was the calling to service from God to Isaiah. So he put his call to service after the first 5 chapters of awes and woes. And now we're in chapter 7. It picks up at a different time frame in Isaiah's ministry. I'm going to read you the introduction to the chapter. I'll probably lay things out for you. The historical setting for the next 6 chapters are a later time than the first 6 chapters. One can see, okay, so the next 6 chapters as opposed to this previous 6. I'm confusing myself. One can see that through Isaiah 6, it was happening during the reign of King Azariah, which was from 791 to 740 BC. That was during the reign of King Uzziah. According to Isaiah 6:1, King Uzziah had just died at that point. Therefore, we know that the year which the event transpired, 740 BC. King Jotham reigned after his father Uzziah had died from 740 to 724 BC, which was 16 years. Now, you can find that in 2 Chronicles 15:33. King Ahaz of Judah began to reign after his father Jotham father's death in 724 BC and reigned until 708 BC, which was 16 years. Now that's in 2 Kings 16:2. Now Isaiah 7:1 through 12:6 is altogether a prophecy made at the same time by Isaiah to King Ahaz. The year of these prophecies can be best determined between 724 BC and 720 BC, which was during the time of King Ahaz's reign and while Pekah was still alive as king of Israel. Israel, northern kingdom, Judah, southern kingdom. Now, Pekah died after reigning 20 years in 720 BC. Pekah began his reign the same year that King Uzziah of Judah had died, 740 BC, 2 Kings 15:27. All right, so there's the time frame. There's a 4-year period which potentially this was written because Pekah was still alive and Ahaz was on the throne. And that's a 4-year span, 724 BC to 720 BC. Okay, that's where we get that time frame. Now we'll go into verse 1. And it came to pass in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up toward Jerusalem to war against it, but could not prevail against it. All right? Now, Ahaz reigned in Judah between 724 and 708 BC because Pekah's reign began the same year that King Uzziah had died, his 52nd year of reign. We can determine that Pekah reigned in Israel, northern kingdom, between 740 to 720 BC, right? Uzziah died in 740 and he reigned 20 years, right? Now, 2 Kings 15:27. We can understand that Isaiah is writing as a historian within this verse because he declared, and it shall come to pass, right? Now, it shall come to pass, in this case, is a prophecy, right? Now, Isaiah chapters 7 through 12 were written between 724 BC and 720 BC. Ahaz started to reign in 724 BC. Pekah's reign ended in 720 BC. At this time, Rezin and Pekah went towards Jerusalem and went to war against Judah, but could not prevail and win. All right. Now, in verse 2, and it was told that house of David, saying, Syria is confederate with Ephraim, which is northern Israel, and his heart was moved, and the heart of his people, as the trees of wood are moved with the wind. Now, after King David's victory over King Hadarezer of Syria, 2 Samuel 10:19, Israel had ongoing peace with Syria, Aramea. Syria wasn't called Syria back then. It was called Aramea. Right? They're the sons of Aramea. Syria, it wasn't called Syria until when the Seleucids came along. They started calling it Syria, thinking that the entire area was of the Assyrians. All right, until the battle mentioned within here in 7. Okay, Israel had ongoing peace with Syria, Aramea, until the battle mentioned here in Isaiah 7:1. The people of Judah were all troubled together as trees of the wood are moved with the wind. Right? Trees tend to move in sync with one another to respond to the wind blowing. Aramea, being the north border of the northern kingdom Israel, was then in alliance with Israel next door to Judah. Okay? Now, if we refer to the original Hebrew, the word, I'm going to tell you about this now, Aramea is the name given of the then translated Syria by the translators. This should really be translated as Aramea, who were descendants of Aram, who was the son of Shem. Originally, when an Indo-European corruption of Assyria in northern Mesopotamia, the Greeks used the term Syria to not only describe Assyria itself, but the lands to the west, which had for centuries been under Assyrian dominion. That's why whenever you see Syria in the Old Testament, it's Aramea. It's just the translators are poor at discerning who was in the land. Aramea, what's that? Well, that's your translators once again. Sometimes I'm kind of anti-translator because of their poor theology. Verse 3, Then said the Lord unto Isaiah, Go forth now to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. What? Now, we find here in Isaiah 7 that Isaiah had a son named Shear-Jashub. Shear-Jashub is a Hebrew word meaning a remnant will return, which reflected the great hope from the prophecy of Isaiah 6:13. Right? The Lord provided a specific location for the meeting with King Ahaz, which was at the conduit or aqueduct by the upper pool of Gihon, which was west of Jerusalem. This was the upper of two pools. You can find that in Isaiah 22:9-11, near the highway of the fuller's field, which was used for washing the clothes before drying and bleaching them. Okay? Now, rather than fight against Syria and Israel alone, King Ahaz had contemplated alliancing with Assyria for protection. This would be something that he would eventually regret. God wanted to meet with Ahaz to advise him to trust in him instead of Assyria. Okay, so that's the reason for the meeting coming up at the upper pool. Now, verse 4. And say unto him, Isaiah is supposed to say unto Ahaz, Take heed and be quiet, fear not, neither be faint-hearted, for the two tails of these smoking firebrands. And then you can read further, for the fierce anger of Rezin with Syria and the son of Remaliah. All right, the Lord comforted Ahaz to not be troubled with Syria and Israel. The term tails were considered the ends of firebrands, which would usually burn themselves out. They would be short-lived already because they already were smoking. All right, so that God's using imagery here. Now, God saw these two kings to be more pride than power, which would eventually burn themselves out. For the fierce anger of Rezin with Syria and the son of Remaliah. Right? He says they're just going to burn themselves out. That's what God's saying. When the Lord says something, you got to believe it. All right. Right. Now, verse 5. Verse 5 and 6 belong together, so we're going to first break down 5 and then 6. Because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have taken evil counsel against you, saying, now, and then the saying is, down in verse 6, let us go up against Judah and vex it, and let us make a breach therein for us, and set a king in the midst of it, even the son of Tabeel. Okay, that's what the counsels of Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah. Now, God does not even once say the name of Pekah, son of Remaliah, who was the usurper who killed his father in order to take the throne of Israel, northern kingdom. 2 Kings 15:25, you'll read of that usurping. The three mentioned, Syria, Ephraim, and the remaining northern kingdom of Israel, had been taking counsel, discussing to go to war against Judah. All right, now let us go, they're saying, let us go up against Judah and vex it, and let us make a breach therein for us, and set a king in the midst of it, even the son of Tabeel. The word breach is translated from the Hebrew word baka, which is defined as break or divide asunder. The identity Tabeel is unknown. It could be the son of one of the military leaders of Rezin or Pekah, one who would take orders as a puppet to them. Right? Does that make sense? I mean, their motivation is to get somebody on the throne in Judah that they can control. All right. Verse 7. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. Once again, the Lord's prophesying to Ahaz through Isaiah that it ain't happening. God made a definite promise that Rezin and Pekah's evil counsel will never come to pass. All right. Now, verse 8. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. The Lord assured King Ahaz that the only people Rezin will be head of would be Syria, the Arameans, and the city of Damascus. And he also says, and within 65 years, a score is 20 years, so 60 is 60 years. 60 and 5 years shall Ephraim be broken, that it be not a people. Whoa. Destruction, the Assyrian captivity. The Lord provided a guarantee stating that Israel, Ephraim, would no longer be a nation of people within 65 years. It was the time for King Ahaz to trust the word of the Lord. Right? So then, verse 9, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. Now, the conjunction and connects this phrase to the previous. The Lord established that king of Ephraim is the same king as the king of Samaria. Neither province will be a nation of people within 65 years. God once again will not acknowledge the name of the usurper, Pekah, Remaliah's son. What's his name is what God is saying. What's his name? Remaliah's son, what's his name? Will only remain as head of Samaria and nothing more. The Lord insisted in Ahaz to believe him or he will be removed. All right? So, trust in me or you're out of here, is basically what the Lord's saying to Ahaz. Verses 10 and 11 belong together. So I'm going to read it together and then we'll go over it. Moreover, the Lord spoke again unto Ahaz, saying, ask you a sign of the Lord your God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above. Depth of the earth, the height of heaven. God provided Ahaz with an opportunity to test him. Ahaz may have doubts that God was speaking from Isaiah's mouth. The Lord asked Ahaz to test him in order to show that it was really him promising his protection. He asked for a sign from below or above earth, and God will do it. Okay? So, one of the few times in the whole Bible that the Lord's saying, test me. It's me saying this, not Isaiah. So, verse 12. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, neither will I tempt the Lord. If you have so much faith in the Lord, then you listen to Isaiah. It seems strange that someone would not want to test the Lord when it is the Lord asking him to do it. Ahaz was sticking with the laws of Moses spoken in Deuteronomy 6:16. The context in this passage was, if one tested or tempted the Lord while doing foolish works, God would step in and stop one's efforts. This command does not apply to instances where God is asking you to ask him for a sign. The real reason that Ahaz was not choosing to take God up on asking for a sign is that Ahaz did not want to trust God, but trust the king of Assyria to come to his aid. Right? It's politics. Verse 13. And he said, "Hear you now, O house of David, is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also?" So this is Isaiah. This is Isaiah ticked off. First of all, you don't believe me that I'm speaking the word of God. Then you won't even take it up on me that I'm speaking for God about testing. So Ahaz is in the bloodline of David. So Isaiah addressed him in this way to remind him that God and the house of David have a covenant established. 2 Samuel 7:10-26. The Davidic covenant. One can sense the rage in Isaiah's heart. Isaiah spoke somewhat out of context. God does not weary because he already knew what was in Ahaz's heart, right? But out of rage, Isaiah was speaking out of his heart. This is Isaiah, not God speaking. All right? God's done speaking for a minute. Isaiah is so angry. He just speaks from his flesh. Basically was what Isaiah said here. All right. 7:14, the most famous verse in the Old Testament, right? The Messianic promise. That's what everybody recognizes Isaiah 7. It's this verse. But they don't take the whole context of the whole chapter when they look at this verse. "Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Now, the controversial aspect within verse 14 is the Hebrew word Alma, which can also be interpreted as a young woman instead of virgin. The reality of this Hebrew word is that it was given within a verbless clause, which implied that the virgin is with child instead of assumed to have a child or will conceive in the future. The argument spent time and energy attempting to prove the passage to have intended this to be a young woman rather than a virgin who has never known a man. That's what arguments against this verse being messianic, that Mary was a virgin or not. Now, Isaiah had provided Ahaz a sign, which had been given to provide a fulfillment within Ahaz's time, as stated in verse 16. So we'll be down in verse 16 in a moment. Now I'll read you something from verse 16. "The land that you abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings." Right? With this being the case, the matter of virginity needs to be put aside. All right? We're looking right now at the fulfillment during the time of Ahaz. In order to allow this to come to pass, one needs to not look to the Messiah being the one being born during this time frame. This child was to be born during Ahaz's time as a sign to him. If this was a child being born during the time frame of the Syro-Ephraimite war, the unknown is then who was the young woman and who was the boy being born, right? Some want to say that Ahaz was to be the father and that his son Hezekiah was a child being born, right? The righteous king. There are also many that like the thought that Isaiah's wife, stated in Isaiah 8:1-3, would be the young woman who gave birth to Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. Isaiah stated in 8:18 that all of the children that the Lord gives him are for signs. Isaiah's children were given to him for signs. All right? And I'll read you 8:4, I'm sorry. "For before the child shall have knowledge to cry, my father and my mother, the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria shall be taken away before the king of Assyria." That's in Isaiah 8:4, talking about Isaiah's son, Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, right? So here you go. There's a second child. We're all of a sudden talking about a second child a few verses later. Okay. The signs are quite similar between Isaiah 7:16 and Isaiah 8:4. John H. Walton does not think that the two time frames can be determined to be the same while considering the time a child matures to be able to choose good or evil, and the time frame for a child to come to speak mama or dada. Now, where am I going with this? But I argue with this opinion of Walton's in chapter 8. All right, the prophecy depends on the intelligence of the child, and there are case by case differences among all children. If it were any other woman and child, it would have very little significance within the sign, if Ahaz was unaware of a woman and child's existence. So it has to be a woman that Ahaz knows about that's pregnant that has a child. If it's his wife, then it's Hezekiah, right? King Hezekiah to come. But if it's not Hezekiah, then it is somebody that Ahaz knows about, that's significant. All right, so keep this in mind. We're going to read you verses 15 and 16 together. Butter and honey shall he eat, and that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. This phrase of the prophecy can be accomplished by both a child born of a young woman in the days of Isaiah, and also the Messiah when he was a boy. Right? I'll agree. It's a messianic prophecy as well. Jesus can fulfill this, right? Now, verse 16. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that you abhor shall be forsaken of both her kings. See this verse 16? Steps in and is actually pertaining to the two kings, Rezin and Pekah. Right? So we're talking Rezin and Pekah. The land that he abhorreth shall be forsaken of both her kings, Rezin and Pekah. A child first reaches moral consciousness at age 3. It can come to be a child born in the future after the kings lose their kingdoms, but this verse calls this a child as if it had been born during the two kingdoms, Aramea and Israel, still having their kings rather than in the future. The Lord was continuing what he had, oh boy, capital D, what he had declared in Isaiah 7:8 concerning the two kingdoms ceasing to exist within 65 years. All right? Both Rezin and Pekah would lose their kingdoms within 3 years of the birth of the child. Right? Okay. Author Barry G. Webb provides an alternative view concerning why God would have insisted that Isaiah bring his son Shear-Jashub, a remnant will return, to a meeting with King Ahaz. Webb implies that the remnant would be returning from captivity, and God had declared the holy seed shall be the substance thereof. All right, that's Isaiah 6:13, which would mean the holy seed of Messiah. The holy seed bringing Messiah, right? Since Zion has been pictured already as the daughter of Zion, the matured daughter is a young woman. She will have a child, and that is the remnant spoken of from Isaiah 6:13. Now this is what Webb is saying, not me. The young woman will call his name Emmanuel, which is God with us. Now, Webb implies that the two kingdoms, Aramea and Israel, in Isaiah 7 will lose their kings before the people become 3 years in captivity. I doubt it, all right? Before the child shall know to refuse the evil and to choose the good. Now, God will be with Judah and will bring Messiah to be born of the Virgin of Judah through that remnant in order to fulfill the same prophecy a second time. All right, double prophecy. First time during Ahaz's life, second time, we're talking 740 years later. All right, now, when Matthew recognized that the prophecy of 7:14 was pointing to Jesus, he pulled it into his gospel. It had already been fulfilled during the times of the Old Testament, but was then fulfilled again by Messiah. The first time it was fulfilled by Alma, who was a young woman, daughter of Zion. Then later fulfilled by Alma, who was a young virgin, Mary. Right? So you see where we're going with this. It's a double prophecy. Verse 17. The Lord shall bring upon you, and upon your people, and upon your father's house, days that have not come, from the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, even the king of Assyria. So you can see that this prophecy all has to do with what's going on now, or in the future, when Israel, the northern kingdom, and Syria go down to the Assyrians, right? And so within 65 years, right? In this prophecy, Isaiah proclaimed that God would bring the king of Assyria against Judah and Jerusalem. He spoke directly to Ahaz, shall bring upon you, upon his people, and upon his father's house, Ahaz's father. These will be days that they could have never foreseen nor imagined, right? So the Judah captivity was not the Assyrians, just so you know, the hint towards this, right? The northern kingdom went into captivity with the Assyrians. Verse 18. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall hiss for the fly that is in the uttermost part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. The expression flies in the uttermost parts of Egypt figuratively refers to the Egyptian army who will come to Judah and defeat them in the future. That's 2 Kings 23:29. The bee is figurative for the army of Assyria, just as numerable as the river deltas of Egypt, who will be invading Judah and will surround Jerusalem. 2 Kings 19. Remember, during the reign of King Hezekiah, the Assyrians surrounded Judah, right? Jerusalem, actually, in Judah. So you see this? All right, we're going to move on and it'll explain a little bit better. Verse 19, and they shall come and shall rest all of them in the desolate valleys, in the holes of the rocks, upon all thorns and upon all bushes. There will be so numerous that they will cover the land and leave no place unoccupied. Is basically what it's saying here. The Assyrians, right? And the Egyptians. The Egyptians first, then the Assyrians, surrounding Jerusalem. In the same day shall the Lord shave with a razor that is hired, namely by them beyond the river, by the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the feet, and it shall also consume the beard. Now, I'm going to read you Leviticus 21:5. They shall not make baldness upon their head, neither shall they shave off the corner of their beard, nor make any cuttings in their flesh. This is of the laws of Moses. This is what the Jews were supposed to be leery of, not doing. Well, God is threatening them, the children of Judah, that this is going to happen to you if you don't repent. The Jews would find what God was going to have the Assyrians do to them absolutely abhorring. The culture was so in tune in the grooming of their hair and beards that they would be deeply humiliated with the torture that was to come upon them. The fact that it was going to be the king of Assyria performing this torture upon them had to be a slap in Ahaz's face when he actually was planning to trust them as allies. Right? Verse 21. And it shall come to pass in that day that a man shall nourish a young cow and 2 sheep. This is in contrast to the fat times when Judah had big herds of cows and flocks of sheep to feed in the pasture. In the future, a man will be poor and only be able to afford 1 cow and 2 sheep. A little bit different than the times they're living in. All right. Verse 22. And it shall come to pass for the abundance of milk that they shall give he shall eat butter. They shall give he shall eat butter. For butter and honey shall every one eat that is left in the land. In the desolate land, agriculture will have been abandoned. The few cows and sheep in the land will be providers of milk. The lack of agriculture will produce many wildflowers and increase the bee population. This will cause honey to be in abundance, so milk and honey will be the most accessible food in the land. Right? That's the reason. All right. Verse 23. And it shall come to pass in that day that every place shall be where there were 1,000 vines as 1,000 silverlings. It shall even be briars and thorns. As Isaiah wrote in chapter 5, verse 6, he repeated it again here. God will make everything come up briars and thorns. Thorns and thistles are the stings of sin in the fallen world. Genesis 3:18. The land will be desolate and grape vineyards will be replaced by briars and thorny plants. Right? Verse 24. With arrows and with bows shall men come there, because all the land shall become briars and thorns. Because the briars and thorns, there will be only hunters in the land, consisting of beasts against man or man against man. Thus a need to be armed when walking through the land will be needed. A very desolate image indeed. Right? Okay. Verse 25. And on all hills there shall be digged with the mattock. There shall not come there the fear of briars and thorns, but it shall be for the sending forth of oxen and for the treading of lesser cattle. In the hills where one would once dig with a hoe, a mattock is a hoe, one will be too afraid to go because of the thorns and briars. Instead, the land will be used for grazing of oxen and lesser cattle. Okay, so go graze in the briars and thorns. All right, so there you go. That is chapter 7. All right, so interesting, the double prophecy. The one prophecy came true during the time of Ahaz. When? Okay, who was the mother, who was the father, and who was the child is the big question. Some want to call it Hezekiah, Ahaz's son. Go ahead, you can believe that. In chapter 8 is where I'll argue that. Okay? Because Isaiah's son has the same qualities mentioned in chapter 7. And you'll find that on our next study in the chapter of Isaiah. So maybe you want to look ahead, and I've broken it down. So Ahaz is a fool because he didn't trust the Lord, he trusted the king of Assyria. And that's what you need to understand here. And so the promises of the Assyrians coming is made here. All right? So with that in mind, now Jerusalem did not get destroyed, but the surrounding cities of Jerusalem did by the Syrians. And if you can read on, and I think it's 2 Kings and also 2 Chronicles, of the damage that King Sennacherib did when he came to destroy Jerusalem. He did all of that around in the cities surrounding Jerusalem, leaving Jerusalem alone for the Lord to protect him. So that's an interesting thought too, that all this is going to happen in the surrounding land. It'll become kind of desolate except for what's in Jerusalem. So interesting chapter. If you have questions, please ask them down below in the comment section. Please hit like down below here. Subscribe to my channel to get notified of the future teachings, including chapter 8, which is an interesting chapter in itself. So bear with me and come back and we'll study it together as I show you my feeling that I believe Isaiah's next son is the promised son of Isaiah 7:14, the first fulfillment of the double prophecy. Second prophecy obviously is Jesus 740 years later. So praise God, preach the gospel, and I'll see you the next time. May God bless.